Part 2 of the Anglo-French War. Then occurred one of those microscopic yet supremely potent incidents which sometimes mould the course of events for centuries. During the bombardment, a special meeting of the British Cabinet was held in a cellar in Downing Street. The party in power at the time was progressive, mildly pacifist, and timorously cosmopolitan. It had gotten itself involved in the French quarrel quite unintentionally. At this cabinet meeting, an idealistic member urged upon his colleagues the need for a supreme gesture of heroism and generosity on the part of Britain. Raising his voice with difficulty above the bark of English guns and the volcanic crash of French bombs, he suggested sending by radio the following message. From the people of England to the people of France. Catastrophe has fallen on us at your hands. In this hour of agony, all hate and anger have left us. Our eyes are opened. No longer can we think of ourselves as English merely, and you as merely French. All of us are, before all else, civilized beings. Do not imagine that we are defeated, and that this message is a cry for mercy. Our armament is intact, and our resources still very great. Yet, because of the revelation which has come to us today, we will not fight. No plane, no ship, no soldier of Britain shall commit any further act of hostility. Do what you will. It would be better even that a great people should be destroyed than that the whole race should be thrown into turmoil. But you will not strike again. As our own eyes have been opened by agony, yours now will be opened by our act of brotherhood. The spirit of France and the spirit of England differ. They differ deeply, but only as the eye differs from the hand. Without you, we should be barbarians, and without us, even the bright spirit of France would be but half expressed. For the spirit of France lives again in our culture and in our very speech, and the spirit of England is that which strikes from you your most distinctive brilliance. At no earlier stage of man's history could such a message have been considered seriously by any government. Had it been suggested during the previous war, its author would have been ridiculed, execrated, perhaps even murdered. But since those days, much had happened. Increased communication, increased cultural intercourse, and a prolonged, vigorous campaign for cosmopolitanism had changed the mentality of Europe. Even so, when, after a brief discussion, the government ordered this unique message to be sent, its members were awed by their own act. As one of them expressed it, they were uncertain whether it was the devil or the deity that had possessed them, but possessed they certainly were. That night, the people of London, those who were left, experienced an exaltation of spirit, disorganisation of the city's life, overwhelming physical suffering and compassion, the consciousness of an unprecedented spiritual act in which each individual felt himself to have somehow participated. These influences combined to produce, even in the bustle and confusion of a wrecked metropolis, a certain restrained fervour and a deep peace of mind wholly unfamiliar to Londoners. Meanwhile, the undamaged North knew not whether to regard the government's sudden pacifism as a piece of cowardice or as a superbly courageous gesture. Very soon, however, they began to make a virtue of necessity and incline to the latter view. Paris itself was divided by the message into a vocal party of triumph and a silent party of bewilderment. But, as the hours advanced and the former urged a policy of aggression, the latter found voice for the cry, Vive l'Angleterre, Vive la humanité. And so strong by now was the will for cosmopolitanism that the upshot would almost certainly have been a triumph of sanity, had there not occurred in England an accident which tilted the whole precarious course of events in the opposite direction. The bombardment had occurred on a Friday night. On Saturday, the repercussions of England's great message were echoing throughout the nations. That evening, as a wet and foggy day was achieving its pallid sunset, a French plane was seen over the western outskirts of London. It gradually descended and was regarded by onlookers as a messenger of peace. Lower and lower it came. Something was seen to part from it and fall. In a few seconds, an immense explosion occurred in the neighbourhood of a great school and a royal palace. There was hideous destruction in the school. The palace escaped, but chief disaster for the cause of peace. A beautiful and extravagantly popular young princess was caught by the explosion. Her body, obscenely mutilated but still recognisable to every student of the illustrated papers, was impaled upon some high park railings beside the main thoroughfare toward the city. Immediately after the explosion, the enemy plane crashed, burst into flame, and was destroyed with its occupants. A moment's cool thinking would have convinced all onlookers that this disaster was an accident, that the plane was a belated straggler in distress and no messenger of hate. But, confronted with the mangled bodies of schoolboys and harrowed by cries of agony and terror, the population was in no state for ratiocination. Moreover, there was the princess, an overwhelmingly potent sexual symbol and emblem of tribalism, slaughtered and exposed before the eyes of her adorers. The news was flashed over the country and distorted, of course, in such a manner as to admit no doubt that this act was the crowning deviltry of sexual fiends beyond the Channel. In an hour the mood of London was changed, and the whole population of England succumbed to a paroxysm of primitive hate far more extravagant than any that had occurred even in the war against Germany. The British Air Force, all too well equipped and prepared, was ordered to Paris. Meanwhile, in France, the militaristic government had fallen and the party of peace was now in control. While the streets were still thronged by its vociferous supporters, the first bomb fell. By Monday morning, Paris was obliterated. There followed a few days of strife between the opposing armaments and of butchery committed upon the civilian populations. In spite of French gallantry, the superior organisation, mechanical efficiency and a more cautious courage of the British Air Force soon made it impossible for a French plane to leave the ground. But if France was broken, England was too crippled to pursue her advantage. Every city of the two countries was completely disorganised. Famine, riot, looting, and above all the rapidly accelerating and quite uncontrollable spread of disease disintegrated both states and brought the war to a standstill. Indeed, not only did hostilities cease, but also both nations were too shattered even to continue hating one another. The energies of each were for a while wholly occupied in trying to prevent complete annihilation by famine and pestilence. In the work of reconstruction, they had to depend very largely on help from outside. The management of each country was taken over, for the time, by the League of Nations. It is significant to compare the mood of Europe at this time with that which followed the European War. Formerly, though there had been a real effort toward unity, hate and suspicion continued to find expression in national policies. There was much wrangling about indemnities, reparations, securities, and the division of the whole continent into two hostile camps persisted, though by then it was purely artificial and sentimental. But after the Anglo-French War, a very different mood prevailed. There was no mention of reparations, no possibility of seeking security by alliances. Patriotism simply faded out for the time under the influence of extreme disaster. The two enemy peoples cooperated with the League in the work of reconstructing not only each one itself, but each one the other. This change of heart was due partly to the temporary collapse of the whole national organisation, partly to the speedy dominance of each nation by pacifist and anti-nationalist Labour, partly to the fact that the League was powerful enough to inquire into and publish the whole story of the origins of the war and expose each combatant to itself and to the world in a sorry light. We have now observed in some detail the incident which stands out in man's history as perhaps the most dramatic example of petty cause and mighty effect. For consider, through some miscalculation or a mere defect of his instruments, a French airman went astray and came to grief in London after the sending of the peace message. Had this not happened, England and France would not have been wrecked, and, had the war been nipped at the outset, as it almost was, the party of sanity throughout the world would have been very greatly strengthened. The precarious will to unity would have gained the conviction which it lacked, would have dominated man not merely during the terrified revulsion after each spasm of national strife, but as a permanent policy based on mutual trust. Indeed, so delicately balanced were man's primitive and developed impulses at this time that, but for this trivial accident, the movement which was started by England's peace message might have proceeded steadily and rapidly toward the unification of the race. It might, that is, have attained its goal before instead of after the period of mental deterioration which, in fact, resulted from a long epidemic of wars, and so the first dark age might never have occurred. Part 2 of the Anglo-French War. Then occurred one of those microscopic yet supremely potent incidents which sometimes mould the course of events for centuries. During the bombardment, a special meeting of the British Cabinet was held in a cellar in Downing Street. The party in power at the time was progressive, mildly pacifist, and timorously cosmopolitan. It had gotten itself involved in the French quarrel quite unintentionally. At this cabinet meeting, an idealistic member urged upon his colleagues the need for a supreme gesture of heroism and generosity on the part of Britain, raising his voice with difficulty above the bark of English guns and the volcanic